If the Mesgalese way was so easy, it was a very different matter when we took the Grammont way, for that meant a long walk, and we must make sure first of the weather. When we seemed to have entered upon a spell of fine days, when Francois, in desperation that not a drop was falling upon the poor crops, gazing up at the sky and seeing there only a little white cloud floating here and there upon its calm azure surface, groaned aloud and exclaimed, "You would say they were nothing more nor less than a lot of dogfish swimming about and sticking up their snouts. They never think of making it rain a little for the poor laborers. And then when the corn is all ripe, down it will come, rattling all over the place, and think no more of where it is falling than if it were on the sea." When my father's appeals to the gardener had met with the same encouraging answer several times in succession, then someone would say at dinner, "Tomorrow, if the weather holds, we might go the Grammont way." And off we would set immediately after luncheon through the little garden gate which dropped us off into the Rue des Perchamps, narrow and bent at a sharp angle, dotted with the grass plots over which 2 or 3 wasps would spend the day botanizing, a street as quaint as its name, from which its odd characteristics and its personality were, I felt, derived. A street for which one might search in vain through the Combray of today, for the public school now rises upon its site. But in my dreams of Combray, like those architects, pupils of Viollet-le-Duc, who, fancying that they can detect beneath a Renaissance rood loft and an 18th-century altar traces of a Norman choir, restore the whole church to the state in which it probably was in the 12th century, I leave not a stone of the modern edifice standing. I pierce through it and quote-unquote restore the Rue des Perchamps. And for such reconstruction, memory furnishes me with more detailed guidance than is generally at the disposal of restorers. The pictures which it has preserved, perhaps the last surviving in the world today, and soon to follow the rest into oblivion, of what Combray looked like in my childhood days. Pictures which, simply because it was the old Combray that traced their outlines upon my mind before it vanished, are as moving, if I may compare a humble landscape with those glorious works, reproductions of which my grandmother was so fond of bestowing on me, as those old engravings of Cenicolo, or that painting by Gentile Bellini, in which one sees, in a state in which they no longer exist, the masterpiece of Leonardo and the portico of St. Mark's. We would pass in the Rue de l'Oiseau before the old hostelry of the Oiseau Fléché, in whose great courtyard, once upon a time, would rumble the coaches of the Duchesses de Montpensier, de Gourmont, and de Montmorency, when they had to come down to Combray for some litigation with their farmers, or to receive homage from them. We would come at length to the Mall, among whose tree-tops I could distinguish the steeple of Saint-Hilaire, and I should have liked to be able to sit down and spend the whole day there, reading and listening to the bells, for it was so charming there and so quiet that, when an hour struck, you would have said not that it broke in upon the calm of the day, but that it relieved the day of its superfluity, and that the steeple, with the indolent, painstaking exactitude of a person who has nothing else to do, had simply, in order to squeeze out and let fall the few golden drops which had slowly and naturally accumulated in the hot sunlight, pressed at a given moment the distended surface of the silence. The great charm of the Grammont way was that we had beside us, almost all the time, the course of the Vivonne. We crossed it first, 10 minutes after leaving the house, by a footbridge called the Pont Vieux. And every year, when we arrived at Combray on Easter morning, after the sermon, if the weather was fine, I would run there to see, amid all the disorder that prevails on the morning of a great festival, the gorgeous preparations, for which make the everyday household utensils that they have not contrived to banish seems more sordid than ever. The river flowing past, sky blue, already between blanks, still black and bare, its only companions a clump of daffodils, come out before their time, a few primroses, the first in flower, while here and there burned the blue flame of a violet, its stems bent beneath the weight of the drop of perfume stored in its tiny horn. The Pont Vieux led to a tow-path, which at this point would be overhung in summer by the bluish foliage of a hazel, under which a fisherman in a straw hat seemed to have taken root. At Combray, where I knew everyone, and could always detect the blacksmith or grocer's boy through his disguise of a beadle's uniform or chorister's surplice, this fisherman was the only person whom I was never able to identify. He must have known my family, for he used to raise his hat when we passed. And then I would always be just on the point of asking his name, when someone would make a sign to me to be quiet, or I would frighten the fish. We would follow the towpath, which ran along the top of a steep bank several feet above the stream. The ground on the other side was lower, and stretched in a series of broad meadows, as far as the village, and even to the distant railway station. Over these were strewn the remains, half buried in the long grass, of the castle of the old Counts of Combray, who, during the Middle Ages, had had on his side the course of the Vivonne as a barrier in defense against attack from the lords of Gramont and abbots of Martinville. Nothing was left now but a few stumps of towers, hummocks upon the broad surface of the fields, hardly visible, broken battlements, over which in their day the bowmen had hurled down stones, the watchmen had gazed out over Neufpont, Clairefontaine, Martinville-le-Sec, Beaulieu-l'Exempt, fiefs of all them of Gramont, a ring in which Combray was locked. But fallen among the grass now levelled with the ground, climbed and commanded by boys from the Christian Brothers' School, who came there in their playtime, or with lesson books to be conned, emblems of a past that had sunk down and well nigh vanished under the earth, that lay by the water's edge now, like an idler taking air, yet giving me strong food for thought, making the name of Combray connote to me not the little town of today only, but a historic city vastly different, seizing and holding my imagination by the remote, incomprehensible features which it half concealed beneath a spangled veil of buttercups. For the buttercups grew past numbering on this spot, which they had chosen for their games among the grass, standing singly, in couples and whole companies, yellow as the yolk of eggs, and glowing with an added luster. I felt because, being powerless to consummate with my palate the pleasure which the sight of them never failed to give me, I would let it accumulate as my eyes ranged over their gilded expanse, until it had acquired the strength to create in my mind a fresh example of absolute, unproductive beauty. And so it had been from my earliest childhood, when from the towpath I had stretched out my arms towards them, before even I could pronounce the charming name, a name fit for the prince in some French fairy tale, colonists, perhaps, in some far distant century from Asia, but naturalized now forever in the village, well satisfied with their modest horizon, rejoicing in the sunshine and the water's edge, faithful to the little glimpse of the railway station, yet keeping none the less, as do some of our old paintings, in their plebeian simplicity, a poetic scintillation from the golden east. I would amuse myself by watching the glass jars which boys used to lower into the Vivonne to catch minnows, and which, filled by the current of the stream, in which they themselves were also enclosed, at once containers whose transparent sides were like solidified water, and contents plunged into a still larger container of liquid, flowing crystal, suggested an image of coolness more delicious and more provoking than the same water in the same jars would have done, standing upon a table laid for dinner, by showing it as perpetually in flight between the impalpable water, in which my hands could not arrest it, and the insoluble glass, in which my palate could not enjoy it. I decided that I would come there again with the line and catch fish. I begged for and obtained a morsel of bread from our luncheon basket, and threw into the Vivonne pellets which had the power, it seemed, to bring about a chemical precipitation, for the water at once grew solid round about them in oval clusters of emaciated tadpoles, which until then it had, no doubt, been holding in solution, invisible but ready and alert to enter the stage of crystallization. Presently the course of the Vivonne became choked with water plants. At first they appeared singly, a lily, for instance, which the current, across whose path it had unfortunately grown, would never leave at rest for a moment, so that, like a ferry boat mechanically propelled, it would drift over to one bank only to return to the other, eternally repeating its double journey. Thrust towards the bank, its stalk would be straightened out, lengthened, strained almost to breaking point, until the current again caught it. Its green moorings swung back over their anchorage, and brought the unhappy plan to what might fitly be called its starting point, since it was fated not to rest there a moment before moving off once again. I would still find it there, on one walk after another, always in the same helpless state, suggesting certain victims of neurasthenia, among whom my grandfather would have included my Aunt Leonie, who present without any modification year after year the spectacle of their odd and unaccountable habits, which they always imagine themselves to be on the point of shaking off, but which they always retain to the end, caught in the treadmill of their own maladies and eccentricities. Their futile endeavors to escape serve only to actuate its mechanism, to keep in motion the clockwork of their strange, ineluctable, fatal daily round. Such as these was the water-lily, and also like one of those wretches whose peculiar torments, repeated indefinitely throughout eternity, aroused the curiosity of Dante, who would have inquired of them at greater length and in fuller detail from the victims themselves, had not Virgil, striding on ahead, obliged them to hasten after him at full speed, as I must hasten after my parents. But farther on the current slackened, where the stream ran through a property thrown open to the public by its owner, who had made a hobby of aquatic gardening, so that the little ponds into which the Vivonne was here diverted were aflower with water-lilies. As the banks at this point were thickly wooded, the heavy shade of the trees gave the water a background which was ordinarily dark green, although sometimes when we were coming home on a calm evening after a stormy afternoon, I have seen its depth a clear, crude blue that was almost violet, suggesting a flora of Japanese cloisonne. Here and there on the surface floated, blushing like a strawberry, the scarlet heart of a lily set in a ring of white petals. Beyond these, the flowers were more frequent, but paler, less glossy, more thickly seeded, more tightly folded, and disposed by accident in festoons so graceful that I would fancy I saw floating upon the stream, as though after the dreary stripping of the decorations used in some Watteau festival, moss roses and lucent garlands. Elsewhere, a corner seemed to be reserved for the commoner kinds of lily, of a neat pink or white like rocket flowers, washed clean like porcelain, with housefly care, while a little farther again were others, pressed close together in a floating garden bed, as though pansies had flown out of a garden like butterflies, and were hovering with blue and burnished wings over the transparent shadowiness of this water border. This skyey border, also, for it set beneath the flowers a soil of a color more precious, more moving than their own, and both in the afternoon, when it sparkled beneath the lilies in the kaleidoscope of a happiness, silent, restless, and alert, and towards evening, when it was filled like a distant heaven with the roseate dreams of the setting sun, incessantly changing and ever remaining in harmony, about the more permanent color of the flowers themselves, with the utmost profundity, evanescence, and mystery, with a quiet suggestion of infinity. Afternoon or evening, it seemed to have set them flowering in the heart of the sky. After leaving this park, the Vivonne began to flow again more swiftly. How often I have watched and longed to imitate, when I should be free to live as I chose, a rower who had shipped his oars and lay stretched out on his back, his head down, in the bottom of his boat, letting it drift with the current, seeing nothing but the sky which slipped quietly above him, showing upon his features a foretaste of happiness and peace. We would sit down among the irises at the water's edge. In the holiday sky a lazy cloud streamed out to its full length. Now and then, crushed by the burden of idleness, a carp would heave up out of the water with an anxious gasp. It was time for us to feed. Before starting homewards, we would sit for a long time there, eating fruit and bread and chocolate, on the grass over which came to our ears, horizontal, faint, but solid still and metallic, the sound of the bells of Saint-Hilaire, which had melted not at all in the atmosphere it was so well accustomed to traverse, but broken piecemeal by the successive palpitation of all their sonorous strokes, throbbed as it brushed the flowers at our feet. Sometimes at the water's edge and embedded in trees, we would come upon a house of the kind called pleasure houses, isolated and lost, seeing nothing of the world save the river which bathed its feet. A young woman, whose pensive face and fashionable veils did not suggest a local origin, and who had doubtless come there, in the popular phrase, to bury herself, to taste the bitter sweetness of feeling that her name, and still more the name of him whose heart she had once held, but had been unable to keep, were unknown there, stood framed in a window from which she had no outlook beyond the boat that was moored beside her door. She raised her eyes with an air of distraction when she heard, through the trees that lined the bank, the voices of passers-by, of whom, before they came in sight, she might be certain that never had they known, nor would they know, the faithless lover, that nothing in their past lives bore his imprint, which nothing in their future would have occasion to receive. One felt that in her renunciation of life, she had willingly abandoned those places in which she would at least have been able to see him whom she loved, for others where he had never trod. And I watched her as she returned from some walk along a road where she had known that he would not appear, drawing from her submissive fingers long gloves of a precious, useless charm. Never in the course of our walks along the Gourmont way might we penetrate as far as the source of the Vivonne, of which I had often thought, which had in my mind so abstract, so ideal an existence, that I had been as much surprised when someone told me that it was actually to be found in the same department, and at a given number of miles from Combray, as I had been on the day when I had learned that there was another fixed point somewhere on the earth's surface, where, according to the ancients, opened the jaws of hell. Nor could we ever reach that other goal to which I longed so much to attain, Gourmont itself. I knew that it was the residence of its proprietors, the Duke and Duchess de Gourmont. I knew that they were real personages who did actually exist, but whenever I thought about them, I pictured them to myself either in tapestry, as was the Coronation of Esther, which hung in our church, or else in changing, rainbow colors, as was the Gilbert the Bad in his window, where he passed from cabbage green, when I was dipping my fingers in the holy water stoup, to plume blue when I had reached our row of chairs, or again altogether impalpable, like the image of Geneviève de Brabant, ancestress of the Grammont family, which the magic lantern sent wandering over the curtains of my room, or flung aloft upon the ceiling, in short always wrapped in the mystery of the Merovingian age, and bathed as in a sunset in the orange light which glowed from the resounding stylable antis. And if, in spite of that, they were for me in their capacity as Duke and Duchess real people, though of an unfamiliar kind, this ducal personality was in its turn enormously distended, immaterialized, so as to encircle and contain that Gourmont of which they were Duke and Duchess, all that sunlit Gourmont way of our walks, the course of the Vivonne, its water lilies and its overshadowing trees, and an endless series of hot summer afternoons. And I knew that they bore not only the titles of Duke and Duchess de Gourmont, but that since the 14th century, when after vain attempts to conquer its earlier lords in battle, they had allied themselves by marriage, and so became counts of Combray, the first citizens, consequently, of the place, and yet the only ones among its citizens who did not reside in it, Comtesse de Combray, possessing Combray, threading it on their string of names and titles, absorbing it in their personalities, and illustrating, no doubt, in themselves, that strange and pious melancholy which was peculiar to Combray, proprietors of the town, though not only of particular house there, dwelling presumably out of doors in the street, between heaven and earth, like that Gilbert de Gourmont, or whom I could see in the stained glass of the apse of Saint-Hilaire, only the other side, in dull black lacquer, if I raised my eyes to look for him when I was going to Camus for a packet of salt. And then it happened that, going the Gourmont way, I passed occasionally by a row of well-watered little gardens, over whose hedges rose clusters of dark blossom. I would stop before them, hoping to gain some precious addition to my experience, for I seemed to have before my eyes a fragment of that riverside country which I had longed so much to see, and know since coming upon a description of it by one of my favorite authors. And it was with that storybook land, with its imagined soil intersected by 100 bubbling watercourses, that Gourmont, changing its form in my mind, became identified after I heard Dr. Persipide speak of the flowers and the charming rivulets and fountains that were to be seen there in the ducal park. I used to dream that Madame de Gourmont, taking a sudden capricious fancy for myself, invited me there, that all day long she stood fishing for trout by my side. And when evening came, holding my hand in her own, as we passed by the little gardens of her vassals, she would point out to me the flowers that leaned their red and purple spikes along the tops of the low walls, and would teach me all their names. She would make me tell her, too, all about the poems that I meant to compose. And these dreams reminded me that, since I wished some day to become a writer, it was high time to decide what sort of books I was going to write. But as soon as I asked myself the question, and tried to discover some subjects to which I could impart a philosophical significance of infinite value, my mind would stop like a clock. I would see before me vacuity, nothing, would feel either that I was wholly devoid of talent, or that perhaps a malady of the brain was hindering its development. Sometimes I would depend upon my father's arranging everything for me. He was so powerful, in such favor with the people who really counted, that he made it possible for us to transgress laws which Francoise had taught me to regard as more ineluctable than the laws of life and death, as when we were allowed to postpone for a year the compulsory repainting of the walls of our house, alone among which the houses in that part of Paris, or when he obtained permission from the minister for Madame de Sazerat's son, who had been ordered for some watering place, to take his degree 2 months before the proper time, among the candidates whose surnames began with A, instead of having to wait for his turn as an S. If I had fallen seriously ill, if I had been captured by brigands, convinced that my father's understanding with the supreme powers was too complete, that his letters of introduction to the Almighty were too irresistible for my illness or captivity to turn out anything but vain illusions, in which there was no danger actually threatening me, I should have awaited with perfect composure the inevitable hour of my return to comfortable realities, of my deliverance from bondage or restoration to health. Perhaps this want of talent, this black cavity which gaped in my mind when I ransacked it for the theme of my future writings, was itself no more either than an unsubstantial illusion, and would be brought to an end by the intervention of my father, who would arrange with the government and with Providence that I should be the first writer of my day. But at other times, while my parents were growing impatient at seeing me loiter behind instead of following them, my actual life, instead of seeming an artificial creation by my father, and one which he would modify as he chose, appeared on the contrary to be comprised in a larger reality, which had not been created for my benefit, from whose judgments there was no appeal, in the heart of which I was bound helpless, without friend or ally, and beyond which no further possibility lay concealed. It was evident to me that I existed in the same manner as all other men, that I must grow old, that I must die like them, and that among them I was to be distinguished merely as one of those who have no aptitude for writing. And so, utterly despondent, I renounced literature forever, despite the encouragements that had been given me by Bloch. This intimate, spontaneous feeling, this sense of the nullity of my intellect prevailed against all the flattering speeches that might be lavished upon me, as a wicked man, when everyone is loud in the praise of his good deeds, is gnawed by the secret remorse of conscience. One day my mother said, "You are always talking about Madame de Grammont. Well, Dr. Percival did a great deal for her when she was ill 4 years ago, and so she is coming to Combray for his daughter's wedding. You will be able to see her in church." It was from Dr. Percival, as it happened, that I had heard most about Madame de Grammont, and he had even shown us the number of an illustrated paper in which she was depicted in the costume which she had worn at a fancy dress ball given by the Princess de Leon. Suddenly, during the nuptial mass, the beadle, by moving to one side, enabled me to see, sitting in a chapel, a lady with fair hair and a large nose, piercing blue eyes, a billowy scarf of mauve silk, glossy and new and brilliant, and a little spot at the corner of her nose. And because on the surface of her face, which was red, as though she had been very warm, I could make out diluted and barely perceptible details which resembled the portrait that had been shown to me, because more especially the particular features which I remarked in this lady, if I attempted to catalogue them, formulated themselves in precisely the same terms: a large nose, blue eyes, as Dr. Percival had used when describing in my presence the Duchess de Grammont. I said to myself, "This lady is like the Duchess de Gramont." Now the chapel from which she was following the service was that of Gilbert the Bad. Beneath its flat tombstones, yellowed and bulging like cells of honey in a comb, rested the bones of the old counts of Brabant, and I remembered having heard it said that this chapel was reserved for the Gramont family whenever any of its members came to attend a ceremony at Combray. There was indeed but one woman resembling the portrait of Madame de Gramont, who on that day the very chapel on which she was expected to come there could be sitting in that chapel. It was she. My disappointment was immense. It arose from my not having borne in mind, when I thought of Madame de Gramont, that I was picturing her to myself in the colors of a tapestry or a painted window, as living in another century, as being of another substance than the rest of the human race. Never had I taken into account that she might have a red face, a mauve scarf like Madame de Sazerat, and the oval curve of her cheeks reminded me so strongly of people whom I had seen at home that the suspicion brushed against my mind, though it was immediately banished, that this lady in her creative principle, in the molecules of her physical composition, was perhaps not substantially the Duchess de Gramont, but that her body, in ignorance of the name that people had given it, belonged to a certain type of femininity, which included also the wives of doctors and tradesmen. It must be Madame de Gramont, and no one else," were the words underlying the attentive and astonished expression with which I was gazing upon this image, which naturally enough bore no resemblance to those that had so often, under the same title of Madame de Gramont, appeared to me in dreams, since this one had not been, like the others, formed arbitrarily by myself, but had sprung into sight for the first time only a moment ago, here in church. An image which was not of the same nature, was not colorable at will, like those others that allowed themselves to imbibe the orange tint of a sonorous syllable, but which was so real that everything, even to the fiery little spot at the corner of her nose, gave an assurance of her subjection to the laws of life, as in a transformation scene on the stage, a crease in the dress of a fairy, a quivering of her tiny finger, indicate the material presence of a living actress before our eyes, whereas we were uncertain till then whether we were not looking merely at a projection of limelight from a lantern. Meanwhile I was endeavoring to apply to this image, which the prominent nose, the piercing eyes pinned down and fixed in my field of vision, perhaps because it was they that had first struck it, that had made the first impression on its surface, before I had time to wonder whether the woman was thus appeared before me might possibly be Madame de Gramont. To this fresh and unchanging image the idea, "It is Madame de Gramont," but I succeeded only in making the idea pass between me and the image, as though they were two discs moving in separate planes, with a space between. But this Madame de Gramont, of whom I had so often dreamed, now that I could see that she had a real existence, independent of myself, acquired a fresh increase of power over my imagination, which, paralyzed for a moment by contact with a reality so different from anything that it had expected, began to react and to say within me, "Great and glorious before the days of Charlemagne, the Gramont had the right of life and death over their vassals. The Duchess de Gramont descends from Geneviève de Brabant. She does not know, nor would she consent to know, any of the people who are here today." And then, O marvelous independence of the human gaze, tied to the human face by a cord so loose, so long, so elastic, that it can stray alone as far as it may choose, while Madame de Gramont sat in the chapel above the tombs of her dead ancestors, her gaze lingered here and wandered there, rose to the capitals of the pillars, and even rested upon myself, like a ray of sunlight straying down the nave, but a ray of sunlight which, at the moment when I received its caress, appeared conscious of where it fell. As for Madame de Gramont herself, since she remained there motionless, sitting like a mother who affects not to notice the rude or awkward conduct of her children, who in the course of their play are speaking to people whom she does not know, it was impossible for me to determine whether she approved or condemned the vagrancy of her eyes and the careless detachment of her heart. I felt it to be important that she should not leave the church before I had been able to look long enough upon her, reminding myself that for years past I had regarded the sight of her as a thing eminently to be desired, and I kept my eyes fixed on her, as though by gazing at her I should be able to carry away and incorporate, to store up for later reference in myself the memory of that prominent nose, those red cheeks, of all those details which struck me as so much precious, authentic, unparalleled information with regard to her face. And now that whenever I brought to mind to bear upon that face, and especially perhaps in my determination, that form of the instinct of self-preservation with which we regard everything that is best in ourselves, not to admit that I had been in any way deceived, I found only beauty there. Setting her once again, since they were one and the same person, this lady who sat before me, and that Duchess de Gramont, whom until then I had been used to conjure into an imagined shape, apart from and above that common run of humanity with which the sight, pure and simple, of her in the flesh had made me for a moment confound her, I grew indignant when I heard people saying in the congregation round me, "She is better looking than Madame Sazerat, or than Mademoiselle Ventoya," as though she had been in any way comparable with them. And my gaze resting upon her fair, her blue eyes, the lines of her neck, and overlooking the features which might have reminded me of the faces of other women, I cried out within myself as I admired this deliberately unfinished sketch, "How lovely she is! What true nobility! It is indeed a proud Gramont, the descendant of Geneviève de Brabant, that I have before me." And the care with which to focus all my attention upon her face succeeded in isolating it so completely that today, when I call that marriage ceremony to mind, I find it impossible to visualize any single person who was present except her, and the beadle who answered me in the affirmative when I inquired whether the lady was indeed Madame de Gramont. But her, I can see her still quite clearly, especially at the moment when the procession filed into the sacristy, lighted by the intermittent hot sunshine of a windy and rainy day, where Madame de Gramont found herself in the midst of all those Combray people, whose names even she did not know, but whose inferiority proclaimed her own supremacy, so loud that she must in return feel for them a genuine pitying sympathy, and whom she might count on impressing even more forcibly by virtue of her simplicity and natural charm. And then, too, since she could not bring into play the deliberate glances, charged with a definite meaning, which one directs in a crowd towards people whom one knows, but must allow her vague thoughts to escape continually from her eyes in a flood of blue light, which she was so powerless to control, she was anxious not to distress in any way, not to seem to be despising those humbler mortals over whom that current flowed, by whom it was everywhere arrested. I can see again today above her mauve scarf, silky and buoyant, the gentle astonishment in her eyes, to which she added, without daring to address it to anyone in particular, but so that everyone might enjoy this share of it, the almost timid smile of a sovereign lady who seems to be making an apology for her presence among the vassals whom she loves. This smile rested upon herself, who had never ceased to follow her with my eyes. And I, remembering the glance which she had let fall upon me during the service, blue as a ray of sunlight that had penetrated the window of Gilbert the Bad, said to myself, "Of course she is thinking about me." I fancied that I had found favor in her sight, that she would continue to think of me after she had left the church, and would perhaps grow pensive again that evening at Gramont on my account. And at once I fell in love with her, for it is sometimes enough to make us love a woman that she looks on us with contempt, as I suppose Mademoiselle Swann to have done, while we imagine that she cannot ever be ours. It is enough also sometimes that she look on us kindly, as Madame de Gramont did then, while we think of her as almost ours already. Her eyes waxed blue as a periwinkle flower, wholly beyond my reach, yet dedicated by her to me, and the sun bursting out again from behind a threatening cloud and darting the full force of its rays onto the square and into the sacristy, shed a geranium glow over the red carpet laid down for the wedding, along which Madame de Gramont smiling advanced, and covered its woolen texture with a nap of rosy velvet, a bloom of light, giving it that sort of tenderness of solemn sweetness and the pomp of a joyful celebration, which characterizes certain pages of Lohengrin, certain paintings by Carpaccio, and makes us understand how Baudelaire was able to apply to the sound of the trumpet the epithet delicious. How often after that day, in the course of my walks along the Grammont Way, and with what an intensified melancholy, did I reflect on my lack of qualification for a literary career, and that I must abandon all hope of ever becoming a famous author. The regret that I felt for this, while I lingered alone to dream for a little by myself, made me suffer so acutely that, in order not to feel it, my mind, of its own accord, by a sort of inhibition in the instant of pain, ceased entirely to think of verse-making, of fiction, of the poetic future on which my want of talent precluded me from counting. Then, quite apart from all those literary preoccupations, and without definite attachment to anything, suddenly a roof, a gleam of sunlight reflected from a stone, the smell of a road would make me stop still, to enjoy the special pleasure that each of them gave me, and also because they appeared to be concealing, beneath what my eyes could see, something which they invited me to approach and seize from them, but which, despite all my efforts, I never managed to discover. As I felt that the mysterious object was to be found in them, I would stand there in front of them, motionless, gazing, breathing, endeavoring to penetrate with my mind beyond the things seen or smelt. And if I had then to hasten after my grandfather to proceed on my way, I would still seek to recover my sense of them by closing my eyes. I would concentrate upon recalling exactly the line of the roof, the color of the stone, which, without my being able to understand why, had seemed to me to be teeming, ready to open, to yield up to me the secret treasure of which they themselves were no more than the outer coverings. It was certainly not any impression of this kind that could or would restore the hope I had lost of succeeding one day in becoming an author and poet, for each of them was associated with some material object, devoid of any intellectual value, and suggesting no abstract truth. But at least they gave me an unreasoning pleasure, the illusion of a sort of fecundity of mind, and in that way distracted me from the tedium, from the sense of my own impotence, which I had felt whenever I had sought a philosophic theme for some great literary work. So urgent was the task imposed on my conscience by these impressions of form or perfume or color, to strive for a perception of what lay hidden beneath them, that I was never long in seeking an excuse which would allow me to relax so strenuous an effort and to spare myself the fatigue that it involved. As good luck would have it, my parents called me. I felt that I had not, for the moment, the calm environment necessary for a successful pursuit of my researches, and that it would be better to think no more of the matter until I reached home, and not to exhaust myself in the meantime to no purpose. And so I concerned myself no longer with the mystery that lay hidden in a form or a perfume, quite at ease in my mind, since I was taking it home with me, protected by its visible and tangible covering, beneath which I should find it still alive, like the fish which, on days when I had been allowed to go fishing, I used to carry back in my basket, buried in a couch of grass, which kept them cool and fresh. Once in the house again, I would begin to think of something else, and so my mind would become littered, as my room was with flowers that I had gathered on my walks, or the odds and ends that people had given me, with a stone from the surface of which the sunlight was reflected, a roof, the sound of a bell, the smell of fallen leaves, a confused mass of different images, under which must have perished long ago, the reality of which I used to have some foreboding, but which I never had the energy of discover and to bring to light. Once, however, when we had prolonged our walk far beyond its ordinary limits, and so had been very glad to encounter halfway home, as afternoon darkened into evening, Dr. Persipide, who drove past us at full speed in his carriage, saw and recognized us, stopped, and made us jump in beside him, I received an impression of this sort, which I did not abandon without having first subjected it to an examination a little more thorough. I had been set on the box beside the coachman. We were going like the wind because the doctor had still, before returning to Combray, to call at Martinville-le-Sec, at the house of a patient, at whose door he asked us to wait for him. At a bend in the road I experienced suddenly that special pleasure which bore no resemblance to any other, when I caught sight of the twin steeples of Martinville, on which the setting sun was playing, while the movement of the carriage and at the windings of the road seemed to keep them continually changing their position, and then of a third steeple, that of Vuxvik, which, although separated from them by a hill and a valley, and rising from rather higher ground in the distance, appeared none the less to be standing by their side. In ascertaining and noting the shape of their spires, the changes of aspect, the sunny warmth of their surfaces, I felt that I was not penetrating to the full depth of my impression, that something more lay behind that mobility, that luminosity, something which they seemed at once to contain and to conceal. The steeples appeared so distant, and we ourselves seemed to come so little near them, that I was astonished when a few minutes later we drew up outside the church of Martinville. I did not know the reason for the pleasure which I had found in seeing them upon the horizon, and the business of trying to find out what the reason was seemed to me irksome. I wished only to keep in reserve in my brain those converging lines, moving in the sunshine, and for the time being to think of them no more. And it is probable that, had I done so, those two steeples would have vanished forever in a great medley of trees and roofs and scents and sounds which I had noticed and set apart on account of the obscure sense of pleasure which they gave me, but without ever exploring them more fully. I got down from the box to talk to my parents while we were waiting for the doctor to reappear. Then it was time to start. I climbed up again to my place, turning my head to look back once more at the steeples, of which a little later I caught a farewell glimpse at a turn in the road. The coachman, who seemed little inclined for conversation, having barely acknowledged my remarks, I was obliged in default of other society to fall back on my own, and to attempt to recapture the vision of my steeples. And presently their outlines and their sunlit surface, as though they had been a sort of rind, were stripped apart. A little of what they had concealed from me became apparent. An idea came into my mind, which had not existed for me a moment earlier, framed itself in words in my head. And the pleasure with which the first sight of them, just now, had filled me was so much enhanced that, overpowered by a sort of intoxication, I could no longer think of anything but them. At this point, although we had now traveled a long way from Martinville, I turned my head and caught sight of them again, quite black this time, for the sun had meanwhile set. Every few minutes a turn in the road would sweep them out of sight. Then they showed themselves for the last time, and so I saw them no more. Without admitting to myself that what lay buried within the steeples of Martinville must be something analogous to a charming phrase, since it was in the form of words which gave me pleasure that it had appeared to me, I borrowed a pencil and some paper from the doctor, and composed, in spite of the jolting of the carriage, to appease my conscience and to satisfy my enthusiasm, the following little fragment, which I have since discovered and now reproduce with only a slight revision here and there. Alone, rising from the level of the plain, and seemingly lost in that expanse of open country, climbed to the sky the twin steeples of Martinville. Presently we saw three, springing into position, confronting them by a daring volt. A third, a dilatory steeple, that of Vuxvik, was come to join them. The minutes passed. We were moving rapidly, and yet the three steeples were always a long way ahead of us, like three birds perched upon the plain, motionless and conspicuous in the sunlight. Then the steeple of Vuxvik withdrew, took its proper distance, and the steeples of Martinville remained alone, gilded by the light of the setting sun, which even at the distance I could see playing and smiling upon their sloped sides. We had been so long in approaching them that I was thinking of the time that must elapse before we could reach them, when of a sudden the carriage, having turned a corner, set us down at their feet, and they had flung themselves so abruptly in our path that we had barely time to stop before being dashed against the porch of the church. We resumed our course. We had left Martinville some little time, and the village, after accompanying us for a few seconds, had already disappeared, when lingering alone on the horizon to watch our flight, its steeples and that of Vuxvik waved once again, in token of farewell, their sun-bathed pinnacles. Sometimes one would withdraw, so that the other two might watch us for a moment still. Then the road changed direction. They veered in the light like three golden pivots, and vanished from my gaze. But a little later, when we were already close to Combray, the sun having set meanwhile, I caught sight of them for the last time. Far away, and seeming no more now than 3 flowers painted upon the sky above the low line of fields. They made me think, too, of 3 maidens in a legend, abandoned in a solitary place, over which night had begun to fall. And while we drew away from them at gallop, I could see them timidly seeking their way, and after some awkward, stumbling movements of their noble silhouettes, drawing close to one another, slipping one behind another, showing nothing more, now against the still rosy sky, than a single dusky form, charming and resigned, and so vanishing in the night. I never thought again of this page, but at the moment when on my corner of the box seat, where the doctor's coachman was in the habit of placing in a hamper the fowls which he had bought at Martinville Market, I had finished writing it, I found such a sense of happiness, felt that it had so entirely relieved my mind of the obsession of the steeples and of the mystery which they concealed, that as though I myself were a hen and had just laid an egg, I began to sing at the top of my voice. All day long during these walks, I had been able to muse upon the pleasure that there would be in the friendship of the Duchess de Gramont, in fishing for trout, and drifting by myself in a boat on the Vivonne, and greedy for happiness, I asked nothing more from life, in such moments, than that it should consist always of a series of joyous afternoons. But when on our way home I had caught sight of a farm on the left of the road, at some distance from 2 other farms, which were themselves close together, and from which, to return to Combray, we need only turn down an avenue of oaks, bordered on one side by a series of orchard closes, each one planted at regular intervals with apple trees, which cast upon the ground when they were lighted by the setting sun the Japanese stencil of their shadows. Then, sharply, my heart would begin to beat. I would know that in half an hour we would be at home, and that there, as was the rule on days when we had taken the Gramont way, and dinner was, in consequence, served later than usual, I should be sent to bed as soon as I had swallowed my soup, so that my mother, kept at table just as though there had been company to dinner, would not come upstairs to say good night to me in bed. The zone of melancholy which I then entered was totally distinct from that other zone, in which I had been bounding for joy a moment earlier, just as sometimes in the sky a band of pink is separated, as though by a line invisibly ruled, from a band of green or black. You may see a bird flying across the pink. It draws near the borderline, touches it, enters, and is lost upon the black. The longings by which I had just now been absorbed, to go to Gramont, to travel, to live a life of happiness, I was now so remote from them at their fulfillment, would have afforded me no pleasure. How readily would I have sacrificed them, just to be able to cry all night long in the arms of mamma. Shuddering with emotion, I could not take my agonized eyes from my mother's face, which was not to appear that evening in the bedroom where I could see myself already lying in imagination, and wished only that I were lying dead. And this state would persist until the morrow, when the rays of morning, leaning their bars of light, as the gardener might lean his ladder against the wall overgrown with nasturtiums, which clambered up it as far as my window-sill, I would leap out of bed to run down at once into the garden, with no thought of the fact that the evening must return, and with it the hour when I must leave my mother. And so it was from the Gramont way that I learned to distinguish between these states, which reigned alternately in my mind during certain periods, going so far as to divide every day between them, each one returning to dispossess the other with the regularity of a fever and ague. Contiguous, and yet so foreign to one another, so devoid of means of communication, that I could no longer understand or even picture to myself, in one state, that I had desired or dreaded or even done in the other. So the Méséglise way and the Gramont way remained for me linked with many of the little incidents of that one of all the divers' lives, along whose parallel lines we are moved, which is the most abundant and sudden reverse of fortune, the richest in episodes. I mean the life of the mind. Doubtless it makes in us an imperceptible progress in the truths which have changed for us its meaning and its aspect, which have opened new paths before our feet. We had for so long been preparing for their discovery, but that preparation was unconscious, and for us those truths date only from the day, from the minute when they became apparent. The flowers which played then among the grass, the water which rippled past in the sunshine, the whole landscape which served as environment to their apparition, lingers around the memory of them, still with its unconscious or unheeding air, and certainly when they were slowly scrutinized by this humble passer-by, by this dreaming child, as the face of a king is scrutinized by a petitioner lost in the crowd, that scrap of nature, that corner of a garden, could never suppose that it would be thanks to him that they would be elected to survive in all their most ephemeral details. And yet the scent of hawthorn which strays, plundering along the hedge from which in a little while the dog-roses will have banished it, a sound of footsteps, followed by no echo, upon a gravel path, a bubble formed at the side of a water-plant by the current, and formed only to burst. My exaltation of mind has borne with them it, and has succeeded in making them traverse all these successive years, while all around them the one-trodden ways have vanished, while those who throng those ways, and even the memory of those who throng those trodden ways, are dead. Sometimes the fragment of landscape, thus transported into the present, will detach itself in such isolation from all associations, that it floats uncertainly upon my mind, like a flowering isle of Delos, and I am unable to say from what place, from what time, perhaps quite simply, from which of my dreams it comes. But it is preeminently as the deepest layer of my mental soil, as firm sites on which I still may build, that I regard the Méséglise and Guermantes ways. It is because I used to think of certain things, of certain people, while I was roaming along them, that the things, the people which they taught me to know, and these alone, I still take seriously, still give me joy. Whether it be that the faith which creates has ceased to exist in me, or that reality will take shape in the memory alone, the flowers that people show me nowadays, for the first time, never seem to me to be true flowers. The Méséglise way, with its lilacs, its hawthorns, its cornflowers, its poppies, its apple trees, the Guermantes way, with its river full of tadpoles, its water lilies, and its buttercups, have constituted for me, for all time, the picture of the land in which I would fain pass my life, in which my only requirements are that I may go out fishing, drift idly in a boat, see the ruins of a Gothic fortress in the grass, and find hidden among the cornfields, as Saint-André-des-Champs lay hidden, an old church, monumental, rustic, and yellow like a millstone, and the cornflowers, hawthorns, the apple trees which I may happen when I go walking to encounter in the fields, because they are situated at the same depth on the levels of my past life, at once establish contact with my heart. And yet, because there is an element of individuality in places when I am seized with the desire to see again the Guermantes way, it would not be satisfied were I led to the banks of a river, in which were lilies as fair or even fairer than those in the Vavon, any more than on my return home in the evening, at the hour when there awakened in me that anguish which later on in life transfers itself to the passion of love, and may even become its inseparable companion. I should have wished for any strange mother to come in and say good night to me, though she were far from beautiful and more intelligent than my own. No. Just as the one thing necessary to send me to sleep contented in that untroubled peace which no distress in later years has ever been able to give me, since one has doubts of them at the moment when one believes in them, and never can possess their hearts as I used to receive in her kiss the heart of my mother, complete, without scruple or reservation, unburdened by any liability save to myself, was that it should be my mother who came, that she should incline towards me that face on which there was, beneath her eye, something that was, it appears, a blemish, and which I loved as much as all the rest, so that what I want to see again is the Guermantes way as I knew it, with the farm that stood a little apart from the two neighboring farms, pressed so close together at the entrance to the oak avenue, those meadows upon whose surface, when it is polished by the sun to the mirroring radiance of a lake, are outlined the leaves of the apple trees, that whole landscape whose individuality sometimes at night in my dreams binds me with a power that is almost fantastic, of which I can discover no trace when I awake. No doubt by virtue of having permanently and indissolubly combined in me groups of different impressions, for no reason save that they had made me feel several separate things at the same time, the Méséglise and Guermantes ways left me exposed in later life to much disillusionment, and even to many mistakes. For often I have wished to see a person again without realizing that it was simply because that person recalled to me a hedge of hawthorns and blossom, and I have been led to believe, and to make someone else believe in an aftermath of affection, by what was no more than an inclination to travel. But by the same qualities, and by their persistence and those of my impressions, today to which they can find an attachment, the two ways to give those impressions a foundation, depth, a dimension lacking from the rest. They invest them too with a charm, a significance which is for me alone. When, on a summer evening, the resounding sky growls like a tawny lion, and everyone is complaining of the storm, it is along the Méséglise way that my fancy strays, alone in the ecstasy, inhaling through the noise of falling rain the odor of invisible and persistent lilac trees. And so I would often lie until morning, dreaming of the old days at Combray, of my melancholy and wakeful evenings there, of other days besides, the memory of which had been more lately restored to me by the taste, by what would have been called at Combray the perfume of a cup of tea, and by an association of memories, of a story which, many years after I had left the little place, had been told me of a love affair in which Swann had been involved before I was born, with that accuracy of detail which it is easier often to obtain when we are studying the lives of people who had been dead for centuries, than when we are trying to chronicle those of our own most intimate friends, an accuracy which it seems as impossible to attain as it seemed impossible to speak from one town to another, before we learned of the contrivance by which that impossibility has been overcome. All these memories, following one after another, were condensed into a single substance, but had not so far coalesced that I could not discern between three strata, between my oldest, my instinctive memories, those others inspired more recently by a taste or perfume, and those which were actually the memories of another, from whom I had acquired them at second hand. No fissures, indeed no geological faults, but at least those veins, those streaks of color which in certain rocks and certain marbles point to differences of origin, age, and formation. It is true that when morning drew near, I would long have settled the brief uncertainty of my waking dream. I would know in what room I was actually lying, would have reconstructed it round about me in the darkness, and fixing my orientation by memory alone, or with the assistance of a feeble glimmer of light at the foot of which I placed the curtains in the window, would have replaced the mirrors and the set of chest of drawers on its accustomed site. But scarcely had daylight itself, and no longer the gleam from a last dying ember on a brass curtain rod, which I had mistaken for daylight, traced across the darkness, as with a stroke of chalk across a blackboard, its first white correcting ray, when the window, with its curtains, would leave the frame of the doorway in which I had erroneously placed it, while to make room for it, the writing table, which my memory had clumsily fixed where the window ought to be, would hurry off at full speed, thrusting before it the mantelpiece, and sweeping aside the wall of the passage. The well of the courtyard would be enthroned on the spot where a moment earlier my dressing-room had lain, and the dwelling-place which I had built up for myself in the darkness would have gone to join all those other dwellings, of which I had caught glimpses from the whirlpool of awakening, put to flight by that pale sign traced above my window curtains by the uplifted forefinger of day. This is the end of the section entitled Combray, from Swann's Way, from In Search of Lost Time, Volume 1, by Marcel Proust. In the next video, we will proceed to the section entitled Swann in Love. Thank you for listening.